Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 2B. And today we're going to talk about the decline of the classical civilizations. And last week we talked about the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty. We're going to continue that discussion today, and we're also going to talk about the Gupta Dynasty, another dynasty in Asia. So let's get this made a little bigger here so we can talk about this. All right, so strikingly, within a period of about 400 years, from the 2nd to the 6th century CE, the great classical empires collapsed. Now, if the emphasis of the classical period had been on the expansion and integration of large territories, clearly the period was now coming to an end. The pattern raises vital questions of causation. What forces pushed a once great society into decline? Are we dealing here with a law of history that societies have some kind of common lifespan that pushes them ultimately into aging and decay? These questions must also address another vital feature of the period of the classical decline, that although there were some common processes at work, the results were not quite different from one case to another. Now, this differentiation helped set the framework for the next period of world history, and it too must be explained. Now, the fall of the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty in China, and slightly later the Gupta Empire in India, marks a great divide in human history. Now, these declines had, if not global, at least Afro-Eurasian dimensions, involving significant changes in some of the structures that had been developed in the classical period. In looking at the fall of these empires, we should note that they all had experienced significant ups and downs. Downs in the classical period. In the Mediterranean, the Greek city-states reached an apogee at the end of the 5th century, and then went into a period of decline. This was followed by the Hellenistic period, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. In Indian history, the fall of the Mauryan Empire was followed by a period of regional emphasis, then by the rise of the Guptas. Chinese classical history had been marked by the decline of the Zhou dynasty over a long period. Now, these earlier oscillations all occurred within a persistent framework, so that we can point to change, but not to a major termination of the period. Now, in contrast, the fall of the classical empires involved a significant alteration in political and, in many cases, economic and cultural structures, after which the world would be measurably different. Now, in this lecture, we'll look at 3 separate stories, beginning with the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty entered a period of greater weakness toward the end of the 2nd century CE, marked by interruptions in Han rule, deteriorating economic conditions, and social unrest. The Han invasions finally toppled the empire, and it no longer existed after 220 CE. The Roman Empire reached at its high point around 180 CE, after which it became impossible for Rome to expand any further. Over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries, and finally in the 5th century, the quality of leadership in the empire deteriorated, and the army began to intervene more crudely in political affairs. Rome's internal training network began to deteriorate in favor of local economic emphases and efforts at self-sufficiency. Now, in turn, the central state was unable to collect as much tax revenue as it had earlier. Now, these conditions were followed by a period of invasion, especially from Germanic tribes on the northern border of the empire. The Roman Empire officially ended, at least in the West, around 476 CE. Now, the Gupta Empire in India began to deteriorate in the 5th century. Emperors were unable to control local rulers, resulting in decentralization. In the 6th century CE, a group of Huns from Central Asia dislodged the empire altogether. Now, these 3 cases span a period of almost 400 years, from the 3rd century to the 6th century CE. And by the year 600, the classical world was essentially gone. To have such similar developments occur this close together suggests that we can identify some common processes and common results in the situation of these 3 civilizations. We can easily point to commonalities in the process. All three empires had found themselves less able to function. The qualities of central leadership deteriorated. Local political and economic elements began to take center stage. Economic performance stagnated, and in some cases, social unrest increased in response to worsening condition. All of this was capped by a series of invasions. Now, scholars have generally identified three coincident factors in the fall of these empires. The first of which was invasions. In China and India, the attacks of the Huns were directly responsible for the end of the empires. In the Roman Empire, the direct invaders were, for the most part, Germanic tribes. These tribes were pushed into Roman territory partly because of invasions from Central Asia by the Huns. The second factor was an increased incidence of disease. These epidemics may have been smallpox or measles, and probably spread from India. Both the Roman Empire and China experienced economic and social dislocation brought on by massive death. Labor was difficult to find, and people pulled back from the more elaborate production and trade arrangements that had marked the empires at their height. Governments also had difficulty collecting taxes, and local landlords would compensate for the revenue decline by increasing pressure on local populations. The third causal factor in the decline of these empires involves human qualities. Less talented leaders were a factor in the decline of the great empires, especially in Rome. There was an increased selfishness on the part of elites who became less willing to serve in government or military positions, and the morale of ordinary people may also have deteriorated. So, do successful civilizations inevitably go through periods of infancy, maturity, and decline? Now, this notion of a human-like pattern of existence for major societies was posited by, among others, the British world historian Arnold Toynbee. Civilizations, according to Toynbee, seem to reach a height that they cannot sustain because their bureaucracies become more venal, more defensive, and less interested in the innovation that created the vitality of the civilization in the first place. The success of the system carries the seeds of its own destruction. Now, some observers today have wondered whether these laws of history and the analogy of the fall of the great classical empires may apply to societies today. The idea of laws of history must be modified for the classical period by a recognition that the fate of the different civilizations varied from one case to another, despite the similarities we've seen so far. The fall of the Gupta Empire in India, for example, was followed by a long period, literally centuries, in which no large empires were created in India, except as a result of Muslim and later British rule. The next time an Indian state was created by Indians was the Indian democracy in 1947, after the departure of the British. Hinduism and the Indian caste system continued to spread India's trade activity and worsened a bit in ensuing centuries, but India remained a productive economy. The fall of the Gupta Empire was a significant change, but did not mark the decline of the fall of civilization. The Chinese case involved real social and political dislocation. The fall of the Han Dynasty was followed by 350 years in which central government institutions did not operate. China was divided politically into regional entities, and landlord power increased. In the 6th century CE, however, the short-lived Sui dynasty was established. With it came a period in which China recovered most of the institutions and cultural values of the Han dynasty. Now, the idea of decline and fall of Chinese civilization would be misleading. There was a major interruption, but it did not destroy the capacity to reinstate earlier institutions. Now, the fall of civilization image applies most accurately to Western Rome. The authority of the state dwindled and localized conditions prevailed. Now, when the civilization revived, it did not do so literally according to Roman dimensions. In the Eastern Empire, created by Constantine, the Roman civilization was replaced by the Byzantine Empire, which maintained many of the institutions and cultural attributions of Rome. Thus, we do not know from classical history whether the maturity of civilizations will result in a massive change in the capacity of social institutions or a period of dislocation, followed by revival. Either path can be illustrated by events in the classical period. Instead of asking why we see decline and fall, we should ask why we see differential decline and fall. One factor is that invasions might be more or less severe, as was the case with the greater pressure of the Germanic tribes on the western part of the Roman Empire. Now, at the same time, India was probably less affected than China or Rome by new disease patterns. And it's also possible, particularly in the Roman West, that the institutions and values of the empire may have been less deep-seated. Thus, the attachment between ordinary people and the empire may have been weaker. Now, 3 durable changes constitute the reason we use the fall of the great empires to mark the end of one period and the beginning of another. In much of the civilized world, the emphasis on empire diminished. Societies were less capable of maintaining large, integrated political structures, were less interested in doing so, or both. The deterioration of this worldly conditions inevitably pushed people to think about cultural alternatives to the political values that had described the classical period. The end of the classical period and the beginning of the next period would be marked by a greater religious emphasis. Now, the changes in the Roman Empire resulted in what seems to be a permanent division of the Mediterranean world into 3 entities: Western Europe, the Northern Middle East, Southeastern Europe, and the rest of the Mediterranean coast, including North Africa. Now, this division marks the next phase of world history and continues to mark world history up to the present day. So this is the end of the lecture on the decline of these civilizations. And a couple things to think about after listening to this is, what, on balance, does the late classical period teach us about some of the inevitable law of societal decline? And why should societies collapse after success? And is this a pattern that the late classical period demonstrates? Another question we might ask is, what was the relationship between classical decline and the spread of Christianity and Buddhism? So as you're looking through your texts and looking and reviewing this lecture, these are some questions that you might want to ask yourself. Now, aside from listening to this lecture, there's also a journal entry that you need to complete for this part of the class. So the journal entry is as follows. So imagine what life would be like as a peasant in one of the second wave civilizations detailed in this chapter. In your journal, go ahead and respond to this and write a little of what your opinion and what you would imagine what life was like as a peasant. In class, we've talked about life as the elite and life as the emperors at the top, and life as a woman during this time period, the difference between men and women. Now try to think of the lower of the classes during this time period, the peasant class, those working on the land, the farmers, and what life may have been like in this time period, as opposed to maybe what it was like prior in the pre-classical period, and maybe even in Neolithic times. We're going to continue this discussion next week, and looking at how over time, up until the post-classical period when we end this course, how the average 90% of the population lived during this time period. So again, this is History 2A from Delta College with Professor Hasselman, and this is the end of today's lecture.